Welcome, everyone. This is the final session of our Kant course. We've now been reading Kant for the past 8 weeks. For the most part, we focused on the first critique, and then we also devoted one lecture each on the second and the third critique. And in the following, you'll be listening to the talks by some of the participants of the course. So my students have prepared talks, and as always, I'm happy to publish them here on my channel. If you'd like to go through the course on Kant and get profound understanding of the critical project that begins with Kant, the anti-dogmatic and anti-metaphysical project, also to a certain degree anti-metaphysical because he's willing to prepare the future metaphysics, of course, with it, then you can find the link to enroll in the description of this video and go through the course in your own time. All lecture materials have been uploaded. That includes 8 lectures, video, audio, and lecture notes. Most of the lectures are about an hour and 10 minutes long, some of them 1.5 hours, so well over 10 hours of material to go through, which gives you exact pagination and references, etc. So you can look at the original in the text in Kant and work your way through the Kantian project in this manner, so that you understand what the 3 critiques, the critique of pure reason, the critique of practical reason, and the critique of judgment are all about, and why and how, after Kant, Fichte, Schelling, Hegel, and later on, of course, Heidegger and others are basically referring to Kant and continuing in their own way this project. So thank you very much for listening, for being here, and I hope that you enjoy the talks. Thank you. So, Wendy, you're first with your talk on the sublime and the always already. Let me just quickly make sure that you are the speaker. Yes. So go ahead, please.
Okay. The name of my essay is What Would Kant Say? Always already is sublime poetry. The etymology of always shows it comes from the Old English all the way, a temporal sense of existing and continuing indeterminately. And the etymology of already combines all and ready with the spatial sense of all is prepared, all is fully ready. But when these 2 words are put together, these words express the concept of a priori, always grounds the moment indeterminately, and already touches the moment as spatially ready. While reading Kant, the a priori developed and synthesized. I followed Kant's thoughts and explications throughout, and yet once I stopped reading, I encountered what I can only call resistance. Reading Kant, I felt no resistance, but once I stopped, I began to free fall. I felt confined and restricted, as if his words were putting my thoughts in a box, and I was left grasping for the key, for a door, anything that seemed solid. Ideas began bouncing off one another and into another, reflecting off unknown walls that appeared and disappeared relentlessly. I kept hearing myself saying, "What am I missing? I'm missing something." And I felt a sizable weight upon me. I was desperate for something I could grasp to keep me from being sucked into thoughts that appeared as inferences, leading to vague, unstable concepts. I knew this was an illusion, but without Kant's words in front of me, I was at a loss. Suddenly, I became aware I was resisting Kant's words. My understanding and reason were silently arguing. Finally, very quietly, as I reflected on my thoughts, watching them unconsciously resisting Kant's words, suddenly the door opened. The weight lifted, and the word that fell into my thoughts created a sense of relief and reverence. The word was responsibility. I knew instantly that this was the responsibility imbued within Kant's transcendental philosophy. I heard myself whisper, "You are responsible. You must take this seriously." The seriousness of all that Kant was saying surrounded my thoughts, and for a few moments I sat quietly as the resistance began to melt. The walls fell and the concepts became quiet. They began to line up as if waiting for me to tell them where to go, how they were to align, and what they were to do. Kant's Copernicus turn prevailed. Kant develops the synthetic a priori in the Critique of Pure Reason, and I wondered, how can an a priori concept become synthetic? Synthetic a priori propositions, Kant tells us, add to the concept of the subject a predicate that was not thought in it at all, and could not have been extracted from it through any analysis. How did Kant come upon this? In his Opus Posthumum, he explains, the consciousness of myself in the formula I am is identical with the proposition I am an object to myself, an object indeed of inner intuition, and of the thought of the determination of that which I ascribe to myself. The proposition I am to myself an object of the intuition and thought of the manifold of the intuition of myself is a synthetic a priori proposition into whose possibility I may not inquire. It is the principle of transcendental philosophy which answers the problem, how are synthetic propositions a priori possible? I hear Kant saying the transcendental I is an object of subjective intuition, a synthetic a priori possibility. Initially, the idea of no access caused great resistance. How is this possible that the subjective intuition and the manifold of intuition are inaccessible? Kant continues, space-time and that which combines both intuitions, the outer and the inner in one, are not given things as objects of perception, given independently, outside the subject. They are mere forms of sensible representation which belong to the subject a priori and contain the general problem of transcendental philosophy. How are synthetic propositions a priori possible? These objects are here given only in appearance as a subjective form of intuition on which the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge is also founded. The possibility of synthetic a priori propositions as intuitions are barred from access, but the possibility of synthetic a priori knowledge creates a ground, a substrate for the possibility of these same propositions. Kant explains, the first act of knowledge is the verb I am, self-consciousness. For I, as subject, am an object to myself. In this, however, there lies a relation which precedes all determination of the subject, namely the relation of intuition to the concept, in which the I is taken doubly, that is, in a double meaning, insofar as I posit myself, that is, on the one hand, a thing in itself, and secondly, as object of intuition, to be precise, either objectively as appearance or as constituting myself a priori into a thing that is a thing in itself. So the transcendental I posits itself at once as a thing in itself and also as object of intuition, seeing itself inexhaustibly as a possibility. But how does the subjective intuition and the manifold of intuition and the forms of space and time become inaccessible? Kant answers the question. Pure intuition, which under the designation of space and time contain merely the formal elements of the composition of the manifold of intuition, and which thereby contain an a priori principle of the synthetic knowledge of the manifold, which, for this reason, represents the object in appearance. The difference of the manifold of intuition, whether it represents the object in appearance or according to that which it is in itself, signifies nothing other than whether the formal element is thought as merely subjective valid, that is for the subject, or objectively valid for everybody, which amounts to the question whether the position should express a noun or a verb. The intuition of space with its three dimensions and that of time with its single one furnish synthetic a priori propositions as principles, but not for sense objects. For they are not apprehensible things which present themselves to intuition empirically, and their representation with consciousness is not perception. Just as little is the system of the aggregate of such presumed perceptions experience. Rather, it is a whole of intuition, which objectively is merely appearance, to which the object as thing in itself is thought as corresponding merely in the idea. The question arises, how does myself as the thing in itself assume responsibility? Kant says, I am an object of myself and of my representation. That there is something else outside me is my own product. But he also says, I am conscious of myself. I think that is, I am an object of understanding to myself, but I am also an object of the senses to myself and of empirical intuition. The thinkable posits itself as the sensible, and this a priori in space and time, which are given a priori in intuition, are mere forms of appearance. Synthetic a priori knowledge is presupposed by the possibility of experience. In this sense, Kant tells us in the Critique of Practical Reason, pure reason can be practical, that is, can of itself independently of anything empirical determine the will, and it does so by a fact in which pure reason in us proves itself actual practical, namely autonomy in the principle of morality by which reason determines the will to deeds. Pure reason brings forth transcendental freedom by itself and provides the conditions of the chain of causality with the necessary unconditioned causality that is altogether self-determining. Pure practical reason posits transcendental freedom as an a priori universal, grounded on the idea that this is true for all rational beings. Kant writes, speculative reason was quite rightly denied anything positive for cognition beyond objects of experience, hence of things as noumena. Reason identifies the possibility and necessity of the noumena, which brings forth the autonomous idea of freedom, which is not in contradiction with pure reason, but is, as Kant tells us, to preserve against all objections the assumption of freedom, regarded negatively as quite compatible with those principles and limitations of pure theoretical reason, though without letting us cognize anything determinate and enlarging about such objects of experience. What transcendental freedom autonomously allows us to do, to order as intelligible things, is performed by the will as grounded in the moral law. The seriousness of this is that we participate in our understanding of the good will, and therefore, Kant tells us, the moral law, even though it gives no such prospect, nevertheless provides a fact absolutely explicable from any data of the sensible world and from the whole compass of our theoretical use of reason, a fact that points to a pure world of understanding and indeed determines it positively and lets us cognize something of it, namely a law. Responsibility is duty for Kant. Moral law is directed towards and determinative of the highest good. As the transcendental I in itself is responsible for the ordering of the will, then it follows, as Kant tells us, that it is a duty for us to promote the highest good. Hence there is in us not merely the warrant, but also the necessity as a need connected with duty to presuppose the possibility of this highest good. Therefore, universally valid and a priori. As Jens Timmerman writes in the third section of the preface of Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, this means that what Kant is seeking here cannot be evidence or knowledge that we really are free. In his philosophy, that is impossible. Instead, what he is asking, whether we have grounds for regarding ourselves as free. Our predisposition towards freedom posits our obligation freely. Pure practical laws do not take intuition as its basis, but instead, Kant tells us, takes as their basis the concept of their existence in the intelligible world, namely the concept of freedom. Judgment acts as a mediator between pure reason and practical reason. As written in the preface of the Critique of Judgment, what makes this purposiveness analogous to supersensible moral form is that since it involves no determinate concept, of a natural purpose with its object and material purposiveness. It is a purely formal and free purposiveness. It is formal as the moral law is formal. It is free as our will is free to obey or disobey the moral law. Moreover, the play in which our cognitive powers are when we judge subjective purposiveness aesthetically is spontaneous, i.e., this play is active, inasmuch as it sustains itself. And in this respect, it is again similar to our will's freedom, which is active by being a special causality. When I reflect on always already, the meaning of a priori appears, but the combination of these two words presents something concrete and indeterminate simultaneously. Is Kant saying something similar, or am I just waxing poetic? Kant explains sublime and beauty as both presuppose that we make a judgment or reflection, rather than either a judgment of sense or a logically determinative one. Hence, in neither of them does our liking depend on a sensation, such as that of the agreeable, nor on a determinative concept, as does our liking for the good. Yet we do refer the liking to concepts, though it is indeterminate which concepts these are. There is a mental attunement to these indeterminate concepts, a purposive momentum that elevates the transcendental I within its reflected aesthetic judgment. The subjective reflection is the source of the sublime, from which the sublime arises, springs forth from the spirit that animates. Kant tells us, spirit, Geist, is an aesthetic sense, in an aesthetic sense, is the animating principle in the mind. But what this principle uses to animate or quicken the soul, the material it employs for this, is what imparts to the mental powers a purposive momentum, i.e., imparts them to a play, which is such that it sustains itself on its own and even strengthens the powers for such play. Now I maintain that this principle is nothing but the ability to exhibit aesthetic ideas. And by aesthetic idea, I mean a presentation of the imagination which prompts much thought, but to which no determinate thought whatsoever, i.e., no determinate concept, can be adequate, so that no language can express it completely and allow us to grasp it. It is easy to see that an aesthetic idea is the counterpart of a rational idea, which is conversely a concept to which no intuition, presentation of the imagination, can be adequate. But how do we comprehend such animating principles? The key here appears to be the indeterminate quality of the animating principles and the use of our power of judgment. As a counterpart to the logical judgment, the aesthetic judgment calls upon reason as a reflection of the aesthetic. Kant tells us, the aesthetic attributes yields an aesthetic idea, which serves the mentioned rational idea as a substitute for a logical exhibition. But its proper function is to quicken the mind by opening up for it a view into an immense realm of kindred presentations. Poetry also takes the spirit that animates solely from the aesthetic attributes that accompany the logical ones and that give the imagination a momentum, which makes it think more in response to these objects, though in an undeveloped way that can be comprehended within one concept and hence in one determinate linguistic expression. The sublime for Kant springs forth from the reflective aesthetic judgment produced by the quickening of the mind and the momentum of the imagination. The sublime can appear as the formless, translated from the German as unform. Kant tells us, we see from this at once that we express ourselves entirely incorrectly when we call this or that object of nature sublime, even though we might quite correctly call a great many natural objects beautiful. For how can we call something by a term of approval if we apprehend it as in itself contrapurposive? Instead, all we are entitled to say is that the object is suitable for exhibiting a sublimity that can be found in the mind. For what is sublime, in the proper meaning of the term, cannot be contained in any sensible form, but concerns only ideas of reason, which, though they cannot be exhibited adequately, are aroused and called to mind by this very inadequacy, which can be exhibited in sensibility. Again, Kant tells us, the beautiful and the sublime are similar in some respects. We like both for their own sake, and both presuppose that we make a judgment of reflection rather than either a judgment of sense or a logically determinate one. Because of this, the reflective characteristic of the aesthetic judgment opens and expands the imagination. Kant tells us, in the reflection of the aesthetic power of judgment, by which it seeks to elevate itself to the point of being adequate to reason, parentheses, though without having a determinate concept from reason, we present the object itself as subjectively purposive, precisely because objectively the imagination, even in its greatest expansion, is inadequate to reason, the power of ideas. Kant continues and tells us the sublime is a feeling that the imagination by its own action is depriving itself of its freedom in being determined purposefully according to a law different from that of its empirical use. The imagination thereby acquires an expansion and a might that surpasses the one it sacrifices, but the basis of this might is concealed from it. Instead, the imagination feels the sacrifice or deprivation and at the same time the cause to which it is being subjugated. When it is sensed that the imagination can no longer rise to the level of comprehension, Kant writes, imagination is inadequate for exhibiting the idea of a whole, a feeling in which imagination reaches its maximum, and as it strives to expand the maximum, it sinks back into itself, but consequently comes to feel a liking that amounts to an emotion. Always, already is sublime poetry. These two words combined are both sublime and poetically beautiful. The other day, I caught myself starting to say, I always already, and trailed off realizing I was thinking of myself as an a priori transcendental I. I wonder, can I refer to myself this way? Can all of us? What would Kant say? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, what would anyone else say? If there are any questions, raise your hands or just speak up. If not, then we just go on. Thank you very much, Wendy. Any comments or thoughts? Okay, we can come back to it then later on. Evan, I think yours might probably fit well.
All right. I'm kind of in the same boat as Michael. It's not done. I spent maybe a couple hours on it the most, so it's still in its raw form. I don't even have a title, but here we go. The transformative philosophy of Immanuel Kant reshaped the philosophical landscape, redirecting the core inquiries of philosophy from ontological and metaphysical exploration to the subject and the essential a priori conditions for objectively valid cognitions of both the world and our role within it. Kant's reorientation commences with the subject, demonstrating how objectivity is attainable through the a priori necessary establishment of subjective conditions for the possibility of experience. Consequently, in the realm of theoretical cognition, our knowledge assertions are objectively valid as they mirror the preformative form of the subject's cognitive faculties. Practical reason is similarly grounded by positing a priori the necessary subjective conditions to self-legislate laws that can ensure freedom. In both scenarios, objective knowledge claims, whether in the theoretical or practical domain, are founded on a priori subjective conditions. A significant consequence of basing the requirement of objectivity on subjective conditions is the threat of subjectivism, a philosophical challenge of utmost importance. In the first critique, Kant meticulously demonstrates the logical structure required for any cognition of the world. A thread of unity must accompany the logical movement of thought, from the unity of our perceptions, application of the categories of the understanding, to the manifold of experience conditioned by the pure forms of intuition. The resulting representation is not the product of passive receptivity, but is produced by the a priori synthesis of the understanding, and it is thus produced through the activity of thought. Because the object of thought is generated through the activity of thinking, the object reflects the logical moments of thought, and this reflection guarantees the unity of thought and being. However, the unity of thought and being is only possible because the subject and object spring forth from the spontaneity of thought, in which the subject reflects the object and the object reflects the subject. Kant secures the subjective conditions of freedom through the movements outlined in the first critique, which post factum demands the second critique. The possibility of freedom is implied throughout the first critique and explicitly discussed in the paralogisms of reason. Freedom arises because thought is a spontaneous activity of the unity of perception that generates the categories of the understanding to provide the conceptual conditions for thought, including causality. Causality is a continuous chain of cause and effect, both forward and backward, and does not allow for a totality of cognition. Reason's regulative ideas provide the principles that determine the totality of conditions and thus the unconditioned unity of all conditions. Thinking of unconditioned totality requires a cause outside of the laws of nature provided by the categories of the understanding. Therefore, freedom of the subject must be presupposed as that cause whose effects are possible experiences, but whose cause is not an object of possible experience. Transcendental freedom and the critique of practical reason, pivotal aspects of Kant's philosophy, show how reason's primacy is directed toward practical or moral activity. Reason as the regulative idea of action presupposes freedom as a necessary condition for thought that arises independent of experience. Only reason can provide the self-legislating principle for the free action of the will generated by the moral law. Practical reason, like theoretical reason, also requires the unconditioned unity of all conditions for moral activity. Requiring the postulates of God and immortality of the soul as necessary conditions of the unity of moral thought. Again, the subjective principles necessary for the possibility of freedom result in objectively valid claims for moral action, but are premised on the as-if postulates of reason. The supersensible realm of reason is the ground of freedom, but only as presupposed for the possibility of ethical action. Although the critique of practical reason expands the horizon of human cognition beyond the sensible, the ground of those cognitions must be subjectively presupposed. The one area Kant has not touched on is our subjective relationship to experience that is not directed towards cognition or moral activity. In the critique of the power of judgment, Kant sets as his task to determine the transcendental conditions for the possibility of the subject's relationship with nature. There are two kinds of judgment, determinative and reflective. Kant seeks to examine reflective judgment, in which only the particular is given, and the subject must reflect on the particular object to bring it under a universal concept. Although still transcendentally grounded, reflective judgments provide the opening in which nature plays more of a role. In particular, the aesthetic experience of the sublime, a profound and rich aspect of Kant's philosophy, suggests a common supersensible ground for both nature and thought, thus providing a possible opening of a ground outside of the necessary subjective conditions for the possibility of knowledge. The aesthetic experience of the sublime opens thought to a boundless infinite that cannot be contained within a totalizing intuition. The encounter overwhelms the imagination's capacity and demonstrates the inadequacy of the capacity to grasp nature in its totality. The feeling that springs forth from this experience is complex, moving from initial displeasure to pleasure through reflection. Initially, the subject experiences terror and fear toward a wild, unruly nature operating without coherent unity. The faculties of the mind confront something so great that the faculty of imagination cannot present the object. The ideas of reason, which regulate the coherence of systematic unity, break down because a totality cannot be provided to the infinite, which cannot be totalized. The subject is physically rendered powerless to bring the apprehension to comprehension under a concept. Through reflection on the might of nature without regard for the human condition, the experience with a negative encounter with the other subsides with the recognition that our highest powers to self-legislate our ethical life is itself infinitely open and is not bound by our sensible experiences, and thus, like the experience of the sublime, is grounded in a common principle of the supersensible. As a result, the experience of the sublime provides a possible experience of the supersensible ground that underpins nature's infinite boundlessness and reason's infinite capacity to freely self-govern human action independent of experience. Through the possible experience of the supersensible, through a sublime encounter, the recognition opens the human up through feeling to the ultimate ground of existence that ties nature and reason in original unity. Implicitly, this original unity of nature and reason opens the possibility of speculative philosophy and the resolutions of the dialectic of reason, to ground metaphysical claims to the immanent movement of thought and being. Ultimately, to overcome the subjectivism implicit throughout the first two critiques, a common ground between nature and reason must be established to lift humans out of the confines of subjective positing and into the fundamental ground from which nature and reason spring forth, thus filling the mind with ever new and increasing wonder and awe, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me.
Excellent. Thank you so much. This is going in the direction of where German idealism will go after Kant. He prepares the prolegomena for the future metaphysics. Thank you. So as always, are there questions or comments straight away? Or are we just sitting here in awe after these two presentations? Everyone's nervous about their next presentation. Thank you, Evan. Very good. Gute Arbeit. You've belabored the concept well, as Hegel would put it. So I think, Michael, I'm looking at the abstracts. I think yours fits well here after these two on transcendental subjectivity and the empirical conception of self, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, so 1 second. Floor is yours.
Okay. So just as a preface, parts of this are only in bullet point format, or I just have dispersed quotes from Kant. So I'll try to work them in as we go, but it might be a little rough. Okay. Okay, so first is a quote from Parmenides' poem, "For thinking and being are the same." And that's related to my paper because I will intend to show how Kant unites thinking and being through reason's necessary postulation of transcendental ideas or concepts of pure reason. Specifically, I will use the example of the self as an illustration of this possible unification. And we'll do this by showing how neither the self as logical function of thinking nor as empirical object is sufficient to ground systematic knowledge, but only when united or taken both together through the demands of reason in the regulation of judgment, through the necessary postulation of transcendental ideas, in this case, the idea of the soul, can thinking and being be unified, possible. Okay. So first, we will explore Kant's application of the self as a logical function in the transcendental unity of apperception. In the conclusions reached in the transcendental deduction, the self is equated to the I think, which accompanies all my presentations in the act of judging. Indeed, this I think is what makes cognition possible. Kant writes, "The unity of this act is at the same time the unity of consciousness, and so that an object is thereby first cognized. The synthetic unity of consciousness is therefore an objective condition of all cognition. Not only do I myself need this condition in order to cognize an object, but every intuition must be subject to it in order to become an object for me. For otherwise, and without that synthesis, the manifold would not unite in one consciousness. It says no more than that all my presentations in some given intuition must be subject to the condition under which alone I can ascribe them, as combined synthetically in one apperception, through the universal expression, I think." However, it is important to note that this self in the I think is not a substance. transcendental apperception is merely a unified moment wherein the I think is already apperceptive to itself as accompanying judgment and does not entail another moment of reflexivity. For example, the rose is red. In this judgment, the I think can be appended. I think the rose is red. But this is not the same as I am thinking that I think the rose is red. And in that second case, the second instance of I could erroneously be accorded substantiality. Judgment is thus necessarily already apperceptive without this self-referentiality of judgment referring to any substance that is I. I.e., the transcendental unity of apperception does not refer ex post facto to a subject's judging activity as though posited in a second consciousness. Inherent in any single act of judgment is not simply an awareness of the object being judged, but also of the subjective activity itself. Thus, the transcendental unity of apperception entails that in judgment, the subject is not merely responsive to stimuli, as in non-rational animal consciousness or in mechanical devices, but rather this, I think, claims ownership of its judgments simultaneously, not in another moment of judgment. In short, judgment is at once the consciousness of judging, and these are not two acts, but one. The transcendental unity of apperception is necessary because it is what allows objective validity of judgment, since it goes beyond the specific individual self, the empirical subject. Kant writes, only through this reference to original apperception and its necessary unity does this relation among presentations become a judgment, i.e., a relation that is valid objectively and that can be distinguished adequately from a relation of the same presentations that would have only subjective validity, e.g., a relation according to laws of association rather than necessity. So, with the transcendental ego, or I think, right, it's not just one, like me as a human being, as a person, but it's valid for all. It's necessary, valid for all subjects. So, not association, not by association, but by necessity. However, in order to secure knowledge of beings in their systematic unity, this is not sufficient. We must, I argue, posit an empirical self, the soul, to which inner appearances belong and which outer appearances affect. This empirical self is what allows us to cognize the simultaneous or sequential relations within the manifold and to order the judgments according to reason, which the transcendental subject spontaneously makes all at once outside space and time. Kant writes, whether I can be conscious empirically of the manifold as simultaneous or as sequential depends on circumstances or empirical conditions. To be sure, all of this is grounded ultimately in the transcendental unity of apperception, though that in itself is not yet sufficient to unify thinking and being. The synthetic unity of apperception is the highest point to which one must affix all use of the understanding, even the whole of logic, and after it, transcendental philosophy. Indeed, this faculty is the understanding itself, from the transcendental deduction. What is notably missing here is reason. Because of this lack in the moment of judging, systematic knowledge of objects in space and time has not yet emerged, and being is thus subsumed under thinking. Next, we turn to the notion of self as empirical object. The dogmatic rationalists set out to prove the simplicity, substantiality, and unity or personality of the soul. However, Kant successfully refutes each of these pretensions to knowledge in the paralogisms. In the argument against personality, Kant writes, an elastic ball striking another such ball in a straight direction communicates to that ball its entire motion and hence its entire state. Now let us, by analogy with such bodies, assume substances, one of which imbues the other with presentations along with the consciousness of these. We shall then be able to think an entire series of substances. Hence, the last substance would be conscious of all the states of the substances that had changed before it as being its own states, because these states would have been transferred to it together with the consciousness of them. Despite this, however, that substance at the end would not have been the same. Despite this, however, that substance would not have been the same person in all of these states. So this is to argue against the like the unity of the empirical subject or the soul throughout time or personality. So in short, this is just an example, one of the paralogisms. But in short, the common error across all of these paralogical imputations to the self is that the dogmatic philosophers did not give radical primacy to the I think, which is what makes possible these false notions in the first place. So in this respect, thinking is subsumed under being, the opposite. Okay, so now we will come to the self as not merely as logical function and not as hypothesization, but as pure concept of reason. Now that we have seen how the misguided notions of transcendental psychology, psychologia rationalis, are refuted in the paralogisms, as well as how the transcendental I think in the act of judgment is insufficient to secure systematic knowledge, we are ready to consider Kant's conception of the self as transcendental idea of pure reason. A transcendental idea of reason is a, quote, necessary concept of reason for which no congruent object can be given in the senses. However, such ideas are, quote, not arbitrarily invented. Rather, they are imposed by the nature of reason itself, and hence refer necessarily to the entire use of understanding. Elsewhere, Kant writes, concepts of pure reason, transcendental ideas, deal with the unconditioned synthetic unity of all conditions as such. In terms of the self, then, the absolute unconditioned unity of the thinking subject is this object of psychology. However, as argued previously, this object of psychology is not a substance, but rather a regulative idea which guides the activity of reason that connects and orders judgments. Kant writes, quote, hence the identity of the consciousness of myself in different times is only a formal condition of my thoughts and of their coherence. So without reason, the understanding is insufficient to judge objects, for without the idea of the whole, the individual remains indeterminate. Without genera and species, or higher and lower concepts in accordance with reason, the individual object cannot be adequately grasped in cognition. For example, without the genus of mammal and subspecies of Labrador, the concept of dog would remain indeterminate. Quote, what reason decrees is the systematic character of cognition. This unity of reason always presupposes an idea, a whole of cognition, that precedes the determinate cognition of the parts and that contains the conditions for determining a priori for each part its position and its relation to the remaining parts. Accordingly, this idea postulates complete unity of the cognition of understanding, whereby this cognition is not merely a contingent aggregate, but becomes a system that coheres according to necessary laws. This idea cannot properly be said to be a concept of the object, but can be said only to be a concept of the thoroughgoing unity of such concepts, insofar as this unity serves the understanding as a rule. Okay, Kant writes, in psychology, we shall, by the guidance of inner experience, connect all appearances, actions, and receptivity of our mind as if this mind were a simple substance that, at least in life, exists persistently and with personal identity, while its states vary continually. So this postulation of the self, of the soul, is necessary to connect our judgments, but is not itself a substance. Okay, so next quote. To think the soul as simple is entirely permitted, in order that in accordance with this idea, a complete and necessary unity of all mental powers can be laid down, even though we can have no insight into such a unity in concreto as principle for our judging of the soul's inner appearances. The principles of pure reason e.g. homogeneity, specification, continuity, indicate the procedure in accordance with which the empirical and determinate use of the understanding and experience can be brought into thoroughgoing agreement with itself. Okay, sorry, that quote should have came earlier. Okay. Without reason, we would have no coherent use of the understanding, and in the absence of such use, would have no sufficient mark of empirical truth, and hence, in view of this mark, we must throughout presuppose the systematic unity of nature as objectively valid and necessary. So, as in outer sense, as in positing the idea of the world whole, as in inner sense with the postulation of the soul. So we can thereby unify all our judgments and give a direction for the understanding through reason. Okay, so inner systematicity, which the idea of the soul makes possible, is thus necessary for epistemic coherence in theoretical reason, as well as agential coherence in practical reason, or subjective volitional consistency. Without the idea of the soul, we cannot bring internal mental states into a harmonious unification required for consistent thinking and acting across time. The demand of reason is that these mental states are brought into accordance with each other and with their external realizations. Thus, the unity of the thinking subject or psychological subject functions as a necessary postulation for ordering those judgments pertaining to the serial appearances of inner sense, mental states, just as the idea of the world whole functions in relation to the unity of serial appearances of outer sense. Neither can the ideas of pure reason be reified as objects of cognition, nor can their related appearances brought into logical unity be cognized under determinate concepts. So in conclusion, the ideas of pure reason unify thinking and being in the systematic synthesis of judgments, which saves the power of judgment from falling into error or contradiction. Only in this harmonious activity of reason, made possible by transcendental ideas, are thinking and being unified as neither conceptualization nor hypostasization subsumes the other. Thus, Kant unifies thinking and being not in mind or in substance, but in activity or actuality. And here I wanted to connect this to Aristotle's idea of or energeia, but didn't have time. Okay. That's it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, you should continue, obviously, and then write on Aristotle. What were you going to say on Aristotle here?
Oh no, I just wanted to defend that claim a bit more. So, yeah, the energai or being at work, translated into English, and how it's in reason's regulation of judgments, or in the goal directed activity of human beings, that thinking and being are unified.
Yeah. So not a given unity, but a unification, a unifying in the activity of thought.
Yes.
Right. Excellent. Go on.
Oh no, that's exactly what I was trying to say.
Very good. Which is also then in line with the critical project that it can't be taken for granted anymore, which it was. Okay. Very good. Any questions? Thank you, Michael. Well, as I said before in the chat, if there are questions that come to you later, just ask them later for any of the speakers. Maybe Dr. Simpkin, to turn to darker matters now, given that you'll be speaking on disembodied warfare and excesses of subjectivism, we could say almost, right? drone warfare. We talked about this. You've written your PhD on this as well, so we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Take your time.
Yeah, I'm going to be speaking on. I am going to be speaking on. Once I can get the actual document up. Transcendental idealism and ballistic missile defense. In this essay, I wish to try and illuminate Kant's transcendental idealism through the example of how ballistic missile defense, which is, Jan has mentioned, is something that I study for my PhD thesis. The earthquake that woke Kant from his dogmatic slumbers was Hume's claim that it was only mere habit to assume that A causes B, and that we just subjectively add on the fiction of causality. Hume infamously claimed that he didn't know for certain whether the sun was rise tomorrow. This is why reason can construct models that have internal coherence, but once they attempt to bind to experience, they collapse. With frameworks alone, we don't get to reality. So, Kant asked, with what right do we combine A and B? And in a way that doesn't just work in the mind of one person or even several, but that provides a bridge between the intelligible and sensible world. Kant's transcendental idealism shows truth as correspondence between representation and object, because it grounds the possibility of the manipulation of the phenomenal world in the a priori structure of human cognition. This is how natural sciences operate. So how can ballistic missile defense help us understand Kant's project? I'd like to speak a little bit about that. Ballistic missile defense is a NATOized system composed of elements in both the United States and Europe, which is supposed to be able to intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles fired from rogue states such as North Korea in the US case and Iran in the European case, although Iran does not currently possess nuclear weapons. Two of the most important European-based components of the NATOized BMD system are located right here in England, in my home county of Yorkshire. Needless to say that should World War III kick off, these bases will be a prime nuclear target for anyone wanting to disable the ballistic missile defence system. And so God's own county, as Yorkshire is colloquially known, is sure to become hell on earth. The first of these bases is RAF Menwith Hill, which serves as the European downlink node for the space-based infrared system. A series of 4 satellites set in geosynchronous orbit at 22,000 miles out in space, each observing a particular quadrant of the Earth's surface, whose role is to detect the infrared heat signature of a nuclear missile launch. Upon detection of such a launch, the space-based infrared satellite sends its data and queues up the second component, RAF Fylingdales, a giant pyramid-shaped radar which can track missiles up to 3,000 kilometers range. The thing about a nuclear missile is that once it is launched and uses up its fuel supply, it falls towards its target on a ballistic trajectory, much like a thrown ball, hence the term ballistic. This means that in theory, the target of the oncoming missile can be calculated, tracked by RAF Fylingdales and an interceptor missile from Redzikowa Air Force Base in Poland, or a Spanish Navy cruiser in the Mediterranean, can be launched to intercept the missile and destroy it before it reaches its destination. Not to say that such an intercept is easy. Often likened to trying to hit a bullet with a bullet, ballistic missile defense is actually much harder than that, since rifle bullets only travel at a mere 4 kilometers a second, whereas ballistic missiles at full speed travel at 7 kilometers a second. To say that the main ingredient in making this system work is money, and it is not actually known whether it would actually work outside of tests, since up to this point World War III has not actually happened, of course. So to say that the main ingredient in making this system work is money would just be facetious. At $400 billion and counting since the 1960s, ballistic missile defense is the most expensive military project you've never heard of. No. Here, the true ingredient that allows ballistic missile defense to be designed, constructed, and to be made to work in tests, at least, is transcendental idealism. Kant's transcendental idealism allows this process to take place because the foundational principles of rocketry, such as ballistics, thrust, and gravitational forces, arise from the fundamental a priori categories of possible experience. The minds of engineers use these principles to design missiles in predictable and replicable ways in the phenomenal world. The end.
Excellent. Do you want to say more?
Well, that's it, I'm afraid.
From Kant to ballistic missile systems. By the way, those of you who will want this published, don't forget to send me, if you want, the links that I should add with your name and your presentation, yeah? So send me those as an email afterwards, so that people who are listening can find you on your Substack or YouTube or whatever it is, or Twitter. Ugh. Twitter. Never call it X. Anyways. That may... This... and especially when it comes to ballistic systems, I think, because it can't really be tested, right? This is the main threshold of the argument, that we can see how this parametrization, let's say, of the world is really here, how it can be used, and
yeah, because the only real test case would be actually World War III, and all the tests that all the tests that they do in development are all kind of rigged. They set the interceptor kind of knows where the target's going.
Yeah,
and it's much slower than in real life situations, and at a much smaller volume of just maybe a handful instead of thousands.
nothing for your test case as well. It would be funny. We should run a real life simulation of it and then see if it actually works, and then see what's left of it, that we can take stock and account for everything that's still around.
The end game of techniques.
Yeah, but we could also just run a simulation. What would be the difference? You know, I mean, why really take up arms? But until your talk, I heard in my head, I heard "Ode to Joy" by Beethoven, with this beautiful Schiller poem, Beethoven's Ninth, and then you came along, James, and now it's gone with that talk. But I fell into cosmic laughter of despair. So that's good enough for me on a Saturday evening. Thank you, Dr. Simpkin. Book's out now, yeah?
Yeah, has been for paperback and online.
Good. All right, so we've got Ravi and Andrew, and then Chin, if I'm not mistaken. I wonder, maybe Andrew, yours is on Deleuze, and then Ravi's is it's quite different. So maybe we go to Deleuze first, and then to Ravi, and then to Chin. Is that okay? Well, so Andrew, that would be you then next.
Okay. Like I say, I want to share my screen.
Oh yes, sorry.
So not right now, but in a moment.
Yeah, let me make you co-host now.
All right.
You should now be able to see at the bottom a green symbol, symbolane, thrown together, which says share screen.
Yeah. It says Bildschirm freigeben. Yeah.
Teilen. Oder?
What?
Bildschirm teilen.
Nein, freigeben.
Freigeben.
Ja.
Das ist schönes Deutsch, ja.
Hat übersetzte sich Mühe.
Da hat jemand mitgedacht. There was Kommentar, there was with thinking here. Freigeben. To give free. Okay, I'll be quiet.
Okay. Okay. So yes. So basically, at the same time as I've been doing Kant, I've also been following a course in Logic of Sense by Gilles Deleuze, and he talks about Kant quite a lot. So I decided to compare the two. So as we all know, at the start of A Critique of Pure Reason, Kant makes the statement that experience is the what's the quote again? Experience is the first knowledge, but our understanding brings forth. But according to Deleuze, experience is all there is. So he nevertheless devises what he calls a transcendental philosophy. He calls it transcendental empiricism. So trying to share this now. Prepared a PowerPoint on Deleuze because it's quite complex, and I thought it was better to explain it as a diagram rather than talking about it merely. How do I? Can you see the PowerPoint now?
Nein.
Okay. What have I done wrong here? Legend freigeben.
It's not frei.
Sorry?
You've got to click on share screen and then select the screen you'd like to share.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. All right. I see it now. Yeah. Okay.
You see? Are you finding it? Ah, yeah. Excellent. Yeah.
Yeah, you see it. Right.
Yeah.
So yeah. So here's transcendental empiricism as per Deleuze. We'll start off at the top here. He says that everything starts with an événement, with an event or Ereignis, which is obviously taken from Heidegger. And these events they occur in the everyday world. They're not necessarily big events, of course. They're just things which happen to us. So at the top here, above the blue line, in the world of Deleuze, we have the material world, materiality, which he calls an outer essence. And below that level, we have the language level, langage, which he calls a transcendental field. Again, taken from Kant somewhat. In terms of time, above the line in the material world, we have chronos, which is T1, T2, which is basically time in Kant. And on the language level, we have aeon, which is the eternal present. So time is just either T1, T2, or the eternal present. And the real time is the eternal present, or the transcendental time, we might say. According to Deleuze, things which happen in the material world are homogeneous. He talked about series. So he talked about homogeneous series. Homogeneous philosophers of homogeneous series are Aristotle, Leibniz, Kant. Also, propositional logic all belongs in homogeneal series. According to Deleuze, that's because traditional metaphysics is a sort of vertical arrangement going upwards, and it's dogmatic. Everything is presumed for the reader. Now, of course, we know that Kant claimed he was roused from his dogmatic slumbers, but Deleuze claims that Kant is equally a dogmatic philosopher. He's not as dogmatic as traditional metaphysics, but he is dogmatic in a way because he presumes meaning, and he presumes the telos for the world. He talks about traditional metaphysics like Aristotle and Leibniz as being a philosophy of the moi, because it puts the in French we have the moi, which is the emphatic me, and then the je, which is the, we might say the idel and the I, or for instance in English it's difficult to translate. The emphatic me, because in Aristotle and Leibniz, the me is at the center. Everything comes from the me. In Kant, it also comes from the I, because he is presuming for us order. He is presuming for us meaning, and Deleuze wishes to break that down. Also, the philosophers of cause and effect come under this homogeneous series, and these events are, we talked about accidents as well, obviously not accident as in car accident, but the philosophical term accident, which is, I think, taken from Aristotle also. States occur in the material world, and these are part of substance. So substance is not separate from the other qualities, but it is part of it. So it's he relies on Stoicism for this worldview. He combines Stoicism with the idea of heterogeneous series, which is a leveling language, heterogeneous series, where there is a dual causality. So above the line in the material world, there's a single causality, cause and effect, and below the line there's a dual causality, which means you have sense going in one direction, common sense and good sense, and nonsense going back in the other direction, or the absurd. He uses, to illustrate this, he talks about Alice in Wonderland, where Alice goes around Wonderland, or through the looking glass, talking to the people speaking common sense. Alice represents common sense, and the answers which she often gets are absurd, from the Mad Hatter or the Queen of Hearts or whatever. So she's answered back with nonsense or absurd. And Deleuze says all of life is like that, really. That on one direction we have common sense, good sense. On the other hand, coming back against this is always nonsense or the absurd. But he says his philosophy is not just a philosophy of the absurd. It's that which gives rise to both the nonsense and or the absurd, and the sense or the common sense. So beyond this level is truth. This upholds both sense and common sense. We might talk about humor being the singularity in his philosophy. So this going backwards and forwards of common sense and nonsense, he talks about that as being a paradox. It's a philosophy of paradoxa, and this point in time, this instance, occurs within the eternal present, and this is a paradoxal instance. So in each event, there's one moment where this going backwards and forwards of sense and common sense happens, and nonsense. And this, in language, he has the signified and the signifier. So these occur also both in language, the word, which points to the signified thing is within the context. It's not within the material world. So it's not like in the theory of forms, where you have the signified thing in the real above pointing, yeah, you know what I mean. It's not like the theory of forms. Okay, so this level of language with the sense and the common sense and the nonsense, if you drop below that, then you lose contact with the top level, material level, and then you end up in the schizophrenic level. He uses a French poet, Antoine Artaud, to illustrate this, who was an artist, I think, who ended up being put in an asylum because he lost touch completely with the real world, the material world, so to speak. So Deleuze says truth occurs on this level below sense and nonsense. In the language world, everything is either material or language with him. There's no spirit as such. There's no other. There's no beyond. There's no second world. And when you lose touch, but you always need to maintain, you always to go into the material world in order to retreat from it again. And you have to, if you retreat from it too much, so to speak, you end up in the schizophrenic. Okay. So here we have also transcendental freedom. He says that as well as the events in our day-to-day lives, life itself generally is one big event. So it's an événement with a capital E, which is a similar model. We've got materiality up here and the eon down below, so language here. So this is the person here, which is a pre-individual person. So for Deleuze, the modernism has created the individual, including Kant, have created individuals. But he says that truth occurs on a pre-individual basis on the non-egotistical transcendental field. So this person here is a mime artist. This mime artist stands for the pre-person. He used, to illustrate the example of transcendental freedom, he used the example of a soldier from one of the wars in France who was highly decorated but suffered an injury and spent the rest of his life bedridden. He then spent the next 30 years writing in his bed with the blinds pulled in darkness, trying to justify what had happened to him and why he still saw meaning in his life. This Deleuze sees as an allegory for all our lives. Everybody is born with an injury. Everybody has an injury or a knack, you might say in Germany, got something wrong with you. All of us, and we have to justify it by not giving in to this injury, but by finding meaning in our own lives. So we're all the mime artists here. We can't speak in everyday life. We can't really find meaning in everyday life, but we can withdraw from the material world and as a mime artist, write in order to overcome this injury that we all have in the world of the eternal present, the eon world. This is also called a Vorstellung, a presentation, which is presumed he's also taken from Kant. You're an artist when you withdraw from the world and justify it. Of course, all life is a process of breaking down, he says, which is a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald at the start of one of his novels. So you break down the material world in your withdrawal, state of withdrawal, but you never withdraw from it completely, otherwise you end up schizophrenic, of course. But ultimately, death conquers life in Deleuze. So unlike with Heidegger, where death is a sort of excellent event, the duality gives eternity more room in Deleuze. So the withdrawal from materiality into the aeon is a retreat into the eternal, so to speak. You can experience eternal life now in this life. Right. So that's an overview of Deleuze. And I also wrote a piece here comparing the two, my thought on the two. And I'll just read that now. So Gilles Deleuze bemoans the fact that meaning and telos are a given in Kant. He presumes them for the reader. Kant apparently said, according to Deleuze, I've never heard this myself, but he translated the Bible into rationalism. Kant translated the Bible into rational thought. And Deleuze said he'd taken his own philosophy from Revelation, because that was the part of the Bible in which traditional ethics had been turned on its head. And that was what Deleuze was trying to do with his philosophy. He was also trying to turn Kant on his head too, so to speak. So he accuses Kant of synthesizing everything, of presuming order. It is indeed the case in the Critique of Pure Reason that Kant talks about synthesis, of course. Synthesis occurs via the forms of time and space in our minds, and this enters our perception. And then we experience things via the senses. This then enables us to present objects to ourselves in our heads before reapplying a priori knowledge to the world of experience via categories. However, this synthesis of the manifold does not presume meaning. Rather, it encourages the subject to apply categories over which they themselves have control. And this is the transcendental freedom in Kant. In this sense, it is indeed an ordering, a synthesizing process, but Kant does not preclude nonsense, as Deleuze maintains. He does in the first critique, I would think. The transcendental subject in Kant sees nonsense, but disregards it to begin with in the first critique. However, this nonsense appears again in the critique of judgment, in Kant's theory of aesthetic beauty, of a sublime, of the one, where also formlessness exists in the sublime. It is present again in the reapplication of the transcendental to nature. So in this sense, it's a question of waiting, and Kant maybe dismisses nonsense to start with, but he doesn't dismiss it altogether. Whereas Deleuze also applies a waiting process in his philosophy, and he says that sense and nonsense are equal. All sense is also at the same time nonsense. And he conceives a metaphysical level that exists somewhere between the material world and language. He uses the expression metaphysics. He criticizes traditional metaphysics. He also criticizes Kant as having devised another metaphysics and having continued the project of traditional metaphysics. But he himself comes up with a sort of what we might call, he talks about Zen Buddhism, so it appears to me it's like a Zen Buddhist metaphysics. And what he calls his singularity is humor. And he also presumes that, in my view, humor weighs sense and nonsense equally. This doesn't make much sense to me. But everybody knows, for instance, the concept of the punchline, which occurs after a rational, meaningful anecdote. Or, for instance, the idea of the straight man. We might think of a traditional comedy duo like Laurel and Hardy, where the sensible man is a prerequisite for the funny guy. So we can't say that nonsense and sense are equal. Stan Laurel, of course, is the funny guy in Laurel and Hardy, like in many comedy duos, but he relies on Ollie for the sense, and without him, there will be no humour. Here, the presence of the emptiness or the absurd appears in the form of a retort or a one-liner. For instance, Ollie tells Stan to go to the ice cream parlour to get some strawberry ice cream, and Stan rings back to the flat to say they haven't got any. Logical, sensible approach takes priority. The emptiness or the absurd keeps ringing back from the ice cream parlour, no matter what flavour Ollie requests, and he always says each time they haven't got any. Until eventually, it turns out that Stan has gone to the barber shop by mistake, and not to the ice cream parlour. The humour is delivered by revelation by the shopkeeper that Stan is at the wrong shop, yet the framework, the synthesis for this humorous element is provided by reason. Without the punchline, the sketch would not stand up, but at the same time, the sketch writer in his head is synthesizing the elements of the sketch to produce the punchline in terms of time and space, which are the forms in Kant. The rational takes priority over the irrational in judgment. Yet even the judgment rests on logical explanation. Stan failed to see the sign outside or the notice outside the shop, or that there was no ice cream in the shop that he was in because it was a barber shop. His head, we might say, failed to synthesize the manifold elements around him and apply the correct categories. Yet the head of the sketch writer did this, and in real life one would expect someone who made this mistake to realize that they had done so fairly quickly. Category of time, therefore, is applied artificially by the writer. In everyday life, a person would apply time and space sooner. To take a more recent example, when George quits work on a Friday evening in Seinfeld, only to regret it over the weekend and turn up for work again on Monday morning as if nothing had happened, it is the rational that overwhelms him, the financial. This produces a nonsense situation, so that he pretends to forget that he quit on Friday, or pretends that he didn't mean it seriously and turns up for work nonetheless. This a priori thinking occurs over the weekend, after the experience on the Friday. Work is clearly meaningless for him, except for the financial benefit that it brings, and it will be only rational for George in the long term to seek alternative employment. Yet the short-term synthesis has to take priority in his eyes. He could stay at home, being Deleuzian, and decide to write humorously about his life, just as a sketch writer does, instead of going in on work again on Monday. But the Kantian overwhelms him, the rational. The material actually has priority over the realm of ideas and language, not the other way round. Humour, therefore, only depends on nonsense, overwhelming sense for a moment, and in that moment it is weighted more strongly, but in the head of the writer it is not paradoxical, it is logical. To take another example, in Kafka's novel The Metamorphosis, the nonsensical hits the reader right from the outset, namely that Gregor Samsa has turned into a beetle. In fact, in the original German, what he has turned into is less clear, but Gregor has turned into an Ungeziefer, which is a lot less determinable in English. But it's not so easy to say what it is. The word exists only to tell us the form that what the form Gregor has taken is not. While the origin of this word is disputed, it has been suggested that the word actually means an animal that is unsuitable for sacrifice. Thus, seeing Gregor has turned into a being that is devoid of worth. Unlike George, who can still go to work, Gregor has great difficulty doing so. Yet here too, the negative concept relies for its meaningless on meaning, without which the story could not stand up, nor the meaning of a word. The meaningful here is the sacrifice to the gods, the positive, so to speak, of which the Ungeziefer is the negative. The sense of worth takes priority, not the sense of meaninglessness. If we assume Gregor has turned into something non-human in his head, he is still performing a synthesis. In the English, using the concept of the beetle, or in the German, using the idea of a Ungeziefer. Indeed, we find many such examples from the 20th century, a century that wishes us to believe that meaningless takes precedence over meaning, and Deleuze is no exception here. Yet Deleuze, too, is performing a synthesis, of course, and he is well aware of this when he declares his philosophy to be about a singularity, namely humour. But as we have seen, even humour, even irrationality, relies on its validity for a synthesis that is a priori. Form and space, too, are essential in humour. In Kafka, it is the form of a beetle in the English, or the form of a sacrifice in the German. In that sense, it is essential to break down his singularity, the singularity of Deleuze, even further, to arrive at logic, which is also the foundation of Deleuze's prose. Otherwise, we would not be able to synthesize his ideas, and nor would he. Where Kant maybe does deserve criticism is that he places these forms in our heads. A beetle obviously exists first and foremost in nature, an animal sacrifice too. It could not exist without an animal, without our ability to sacrifice also. So the origin is not in our heads. If a tree falls down in a forest and I don't see it, it still falls down, obviously. The manifold then was already ordered before it entered our heads via our senses. We didn't order it in our heads. It is a variety of forms of beings in the world, and judgments which we make rely both on our own synthesis, but also on the inherent order in the world, which enable these judgments to take place in the first case. Nonetheless, it would be incorrect in my view to assume that Kant intended to replace traditional metaphysics, but rather he creates new forms in order to focus on that which is knowable, rather than having man rely merely on metaphysical concepts, but dogmatic slumbers, so to speak, that are inherently irrational in themselves, but of which various versions may be constructed. In that sense, Kant's project is both logical and epistemological. In the eyes of Deleuze, however, Kant has merely continued metaphysics. In the third critique, the critique of judgment, we again arrive with Kant at forms of aesthetic beauty, of which several versions may be constructed that are inherently consistent and valid, something we might indeed call metaphysics. In the critique of pure reason, however, the goal is to uphold science and posit human freedom, regardless of the laws of nature and causality. In the eyes of Deleuze, all physics is metaphysics and all metaphysics is physics. Yet in the latter case, he means Deleuzian metaphysics, of course, the metaphysics of humour, a metaphysics that fails to acknowledge that what gives rise to nothingness, no thingness, is thingness, and what gives rise to nonsense is sense, but not equal. Sense has priority, and what gives rise to humour is not logic, but illogic. Sorry, it's not illogic, but logic. It is the surface also that gives rise to thinking. Thinking and being are one in Kant, as Kant shows, and thinking on the surface level may well require a god or some sort for its justification, as Kant says in the Critique of Practical Reason, but this does not make thinking itself illogical. Rather, Kant bridges the gap between logic and ontology, while Deleuze posits an ontology that is based on illogic, an unreasoned equality of sense and nonsense. The philosophy of Gilles Deleuze is fascinating, but it is of limited practical use. Not only does his levelling of sense and nonsense and his singularity of humour appear to rule out aesthetic beauty, such as we might find in the Critique of Judgment, it is of course difficult to imagine a political system based on such a philosophy. The judgment itself is precluded in Deleuze. He says we should never judge. So how could we even have law courts in the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze? In this context, we might refer here to Kant's separation of public and private reason. The Deleuzean system can only realistically pertain to private reason in the role of a scholar, in the guise of a scholar. In that sense, the Zen Buddhist metaphysics of Deleuze is a fine example of scholarship. Indeed, Kant himself states in his essay, What is Enlightenment? That argue as much as you want and about what you want, but obey. Here as elsewhere, when things are considered in a broad perspective, a strange, unexpected pattern in human affairs reveals itself, one in which almost everything is paradoxical. The paradoxical then not only exists within the Deleuzean system, but in the interplay between public and private reason in Immanuel Kant. Bearing that in mind, nonsense, the singularity of humour in Deleuze, has to be separated off into the sphere of private reason for public reason. The primacy of sense over nonsense is essential. For if it is not, it will be the individual that it will not be the individual that ends up schizophrenic, but society itself.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you. Very good one. Okay. Are there questions for now? Can I bring everyone back? I don't even know. Probably need to. You probably stop the screen sharing now so that see everyone again. I don't know. I can't. So you'd have to.
Says was interrupted. Why I was stopping.
Yeah.
All right, it's worked now. Yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions or anything for now on this? It's a bit of a weird move by Deleuze, to be honest. I mean, first of all, I don't think that he fully understands what transcendental means. Then he has this very vorstellungshafte representational account of two worlds. That's just basic Platonism 101.
He claimed it's not Platonism, but I think it probably is, really.
Yeah, and it's highly dogmatic. It's a strange sort of dogmatic rationalism where now the soul is inflicted with a wound, etc., and all these massive presuppositions that are just basically supposed, gesetzt, a totally non-critical philosophy. It's highly dogmatic. Highly dogmatic, but one that is at the same time absolutizing nonsense, which always leads me with the same with Foucault, and he says, okay, then I don't have to listen to you. If there's no truth, then I don't have to consider what you say. That's what I always find very difficult with these accounts, with these strange post-war philosophies. It's sort of Sean put it like this: that Deleuze speaks in the language of Gestell, and I wonder why. Well, anyway, that's just me. And so, anyone else on this on Deleuze? No. Well, then we have one. Thank you, Andrew. There was, I think. So the Popper and Spengler one was very good, but I think this one so far was the best one. What we will do is Evan has already left. I'll send you all an email, including Chin, of course. So we'll set a deadline for very soon, which is next Saturday, to have you send me a first draft, and I'll get this back within a day or two at the latest. Then another 2 or 3 weeks for corrections. That's long enough. And then this time I'll have enough of a time in the summer that I can put these together and publish them as a PDF in one booklet. So we'll do that this time. And because you've all written really great essays, so I think they deserve that. Okay, so Ravi, I think you're, at least for the public section, you're the final speaker.
Yep. Thanks, everyone. Today I'm speaking on a poem by Wallace Stevens, which kind of called out to me when we were in the middle of the lectures, and I found some connections, I thought, between Kant's worldview and the poem. So this is titled Things as They Are, Wallace Stevens's Response to Kant's Inescapable Vision. The pheasant sleeps, the employer and the employee combat each other, and there is a man playing a blue guitar. This is the panoply of what there is, with nothing added to it, with no enchantment or secret vital essence, no special spiritual force behind them. What else do we have but this? It must be this rhapsody or none, the rhapsody of things as they are, Wallace Stevens writes in his poem, The Man with the Blue Guitar. By this, Stevens perhaps means that the world as it is akin to a complex interplay of an emotive musical composition. We detect a hint of irony as well, as when we fear that the world is not really as complex or sophisticated as a rhapsody, and is instead a dull and meaningless collision. But Stevens does mean that there is nothing more to the world than what is there. It is remarkable that Stevens still finds a place for poetry here. I will read Stevens's poem as a response to the worldview initiated by a towering intellectual figure, philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant's major works provided a critique of nothing less than the capacity of reason to understand its own workings and organize life itself. Though he wrote at the height of the Enlightenment in the late 18th century, where advanced thinkers heralded the age that would be governed by reason, the world as it was still immersed in custom and metaphysical religion at that point. So it is not surprising that it took another century and more for the vision of life he expressed to make its way into poetry in Stevens' 1937 poem. Stevens, in my view, responded powerfully with a sense of disappointment and confusion to the loss of metaphysical enchantment and certainty that the pre-Kantian worldview held. But at times, he suggests the possibility of accommodation to the new view, and further holds that exploring the poetic sublime and the internal landscape may be a response to that view that still holds meaning for life. We start with the rhapsody. In Kant's first critique, the critique of pure reason, he attempts to answer the question of how science itself is possible. Science posits an external world that is stable, with the sun rising, apples falling, and machines running according to predictable laws. But why should these knowable laws be able to govern the workings of the world? Before Kant, there were two main schools of thought on this matter, the rationalists and the empiricists. Rationalists believed that the mind was given access to all the rational principles needed to understand the world a priori, without any actual experience of the world, while empiricists believed that there was no a priori access to knowledge, and that all knowledge was derived a posteriori. Further, there was no rational principle that guaranteed that the laws of the world, as they were, but they were simply mental habits of association. Kant came up with the revolutionary solution that the rational laws we perceived in the world were a consequence of how the mind itself was structured in a rational way that produced rational laws. The a priori categories of the understanding such as the idea of causality, which posits causal connections between events, combined with central intuitions pre-formatted according to a priori structures to produce the objective world of objects that could be known rationally. The process that allows the world to be known at all is thus a sort of rhapsody of the understanding, and there is a richness to letting things be as they are with this rhapsody in view. Kant divested the world of supernatural force and intent, but left us with the rhapsody of understanding the phenomena of the world, the things as they are. For modern man, it must be this rhapsody, that of objects known through scientific knowledge, or else a return to the cave of ignorance. It must be this rhapsody or none, indeed. Beyond the rhapsody, the central figure of the poem, too, can be seen as a figure for the process of the mind relating to experience. The day was green, the poem says. A mythical they then says to the guitarist, "You have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are." But the guitarist responds, "Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar. The blue guitar itself shapes experience. The formatting the guitar provides the material of human experience, regardless of the demand on the experience of the they to conform to an unknowable thing in itself." As a consequence of this view, much that is lovable by the human heart was rendered obsolete. For according to reason's own self-critique, the mind can only know the world of appearances, of objects rendered according to the rational laws of the mind itself. There is no recourse to proofs about any other supernatural forces, as those are seen to always collapse on themselves. For Stevens, this leads to a collapse of certainty and vision. Quote, "The earth is not earth, but a stone, not the mother that held men as they fall, but stone, but like a stone. No, not the mother, but an oppressor," unquote. Stevens is no longer able to see the earth as a supportive and nourishing mother, now that it is known only as the stone that it is seen through the scientific reason. The tone of disappointment is palpable throughout these lines. Similarly, Stevens is disappointed with the possibilities of the good that can be known in the Kantian view. Since the time of Plato, the good has been symbolized by the sun, but there is no possibility for Stevens of being, quote, "part of the sun," unquote, anymore. That is, having union with the good as part of the nature of things. There is the idea of the highest good that Kant offers, but if it is no longer a property of things in themselves, then Stevens is left unsatisfied. Quote, "The sun no longer shares our works," and then later, "And shall I then stand in the sun, as now I stand in the moon, and call it good, the immaculate, the merciful good, detached from us, from things as they are, not to be part of the sun, to stand remote and call it merciful," he writes. Though Kant posits that there must be the idea of God, for the human reason to guide the strivings of the will, it must be beyond what is known as certain, for only the world of appearances can be known with certainty, and God and goodness do not appear in that view. Stevens is a distinctly post-Kantian poet because he knows that he cannot return to the world of certainties, no matter how much the emotion longs for them. Rather than positing a fantasy world where the certainties of God and the summum bonum still exist, he gives expression to the emotion of being cut off from the certainties in these beautiful lines. Despite the longing for the good experienced as a thing in itself, there is at times in the poem an accommodation to the new reality. There is the understanding that life itself goes on. Slowly, the ivy on the stones becomes the stones, women become the cities, children become the fields, and men in waves become the sea. Somehow, man persists through the disenchantment. There are cycles, cities, women, and men, the return of historical forces of the returning sea and fields as the process of life continues. But the real possibility for life Stevens sees is in poetry itself. For Kant and his third critique, the beautiful and sublime do not have to do primarily with works of art, but with our reactions to nature itself. This might seem to rule out Stevens's views on poetry expressed in the poem, but it seems as though poetry is a force of nature. Quote, "Perhaps it gives in the universal intercourse," unquote, Stevens says of poetry. Earlier in the stanza, he writes, "Poetry is the subject of the poem. From this the poem issues, and to this returns. Between the two, between issue and return, there is an absence in reality. Things as they are, or so we say. But are these separate? Is it an absence for the poem, which acquires its true appearances there? Sun's green, clouds red, earth feeling, sky that thinks? Stevens posits poetry as a feature of the world, which fills up empty space with paradoxical appearances. It is only here that we have hope for human life, he seems to suggest. Quote, poetry, exceeding music, must take the place of empty heaven and its hymns. Unquote. What is poetry capable of? Poetry can depict those moments of natural beauty, or something even beyond beauty, where all seems to overwhelm us. The vivid, florid, turgid sky, the drenching thunder rolling by, the morning still deluged by night, the clouds tumultuously bright, and the feeling heavy in cold chords, struggling towards impassioned choirs. Here there is a rich description of the storm, its vividness and heaviness, its sweeping quality. He goes on to say, I know my lazy leaden twang is like the reason in a storm, and yet it brings a storm to bear. I twang it out and leave it there. Although this latter part of the verse verges on the dismissive, trivializing poetry and the storm with the idea of lazy leaden twang, he ultimately affirms reason's capacity and poetry's capacity to confront the storm, to rise to the level of the storm. In Kant's idea of the sublime, we are awed and terrified by sublimity, but still it calls out something in us which is able to rise to its level. The sublime isn't ultimately about the object, but about what happens in the relation between the subject and the object. When Stevens, with his twang, brings the storm to bear, he describes the capacity of poetry to raise the soul to the sublime. But unlike with Romantic era poetry, there is no world soul animating the storm, or the song of the guitar, or the sun or the moon. Stevens's world has no mysterious vitality behind it. Compare this to the lines of Samuel Coleridge's The Aeolian Harp, as shared by our colleague Jin Choi. And what if all of animated nature be but organic harps diversely framed, that tremble into thought, as o'er them sweeps plastic and vast, one intellectual breeze, at once the soul of each and God of all. In this vision, the world soul animates the harps, meaning that it takes each individual as its instrument, stimulating it to the expression of its individual spiritual essence. The blue guitar in Stevens's poem is not similarly representative of any cosmic process, though. The player is divorced from society, from things as they are, even the goodness of the sun. It is remarkable that Stevens is able to find poetic beauty anywhere in this conception, yet poetry is still there as a saving force. It is here where Stevens most departs from the vision that Kant held out for human life. Whereas Kant envisioned a world in which all saw their actions guided by the gravity of their reflection that their action should stand up to be made a universal law, Stevens sees a lack of fulfillment in this world that would separate him from living in the goodness of the sun. Instead, Stevens seems to conclude towards the end of the poem that it is the exploration of the inner life that would grant possibility to human life. Quote, throw away the lights, the definitions, and say of what you see in the dark, that it is this or that it is that, but do not use the rotted names. And later, throw the lights away. Nothing must stand between you and the shapes you take when the crust of shape has been destroyed. Unquote. This is the danger in Stevens's vision, that we will be so disappointed by the lack of fulfillment in the Kantian world that we will turn away from the light of reason and step back from what it has shown us into a darkness where we searched for some other supposed truth beyond name and light. Kant's view provides us with the strictness of the critical reason's reflection on the boundaries of what we may know, say, and do. But it is not perhaps a nurturing view that will let us feel at home on earth, and Stevens goes a long way towards expressing the heart's reaction to this. We can't stop with Stevens, though. Though his disappointment gives us beautiful poetry, it is not ultimately a guide to life that we need. And that's the end.
Always end on a high note. That was a high note, that essay and that presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
This concludes, I think, the public presentations. If you'd like to add anything, speak now. You can also tell him in person. You don't have to put it in the chat if you want. Okay. Thank you very much again, Ravi. Good you brought in Coleridge here. I mean, in some way, this is very I mean, I have to look at it then next week when you send it to me. But what could also be added, just because it's bubbling up and we discussed it, is panpsychism, which basically is a return to the world soul in a scientistic manner, I would say. But you don't have to go there. So, as there are no comments for now, I'll say thank you very much. Good night.